The question is always, are they specifically trying to do this? Do they have a plan to do this by a time certain? Or is this just part of a process of always having plans available, of always trying to make sure that contingencies can be addressed? What seems clear to me is that there's a lot of friction between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government. Threats, for instance, to unleash hell if all the hostages are released, coming and going without hell being unleashed. The Netanyahu government being taken by surprise with the Gaza announcement. And this most recent declaration or leak that the Israelis may be seriously entertaining the prospect of launching attacks on Iranian nuclear strikes. That could mean that these sorts of strikes are imminent. It could also mean that that somebody in the U.S. government or that somebody in the Israeli government is trying to raise the stakes, either on Iran or on the United States, or simply displaying to the Israeli public that Prime Minister Netanyahu really remains tough on security. He's got a tough coalition to manage, lots of divisions in his cabinet and in the broader right-wing movement, and doubling down on the Iranian threat is one way to do that. One thing that's interesting is the Israelis probably could not carry out these sorts of strikes without U.S. participation. And even though the Trump administration has a lot of Iran hawks, and even though the Iranian government has targeted members of the administration, it's not likely that without some further provocation, this sort of a direct confrontation would come to pass right now.
Walk me through what exactly happened with the hostage release this weekend. It seems as if Hamas stuck to the script here, despite the fact that Trump was ramping up threats, saying that all hostages needed to be released by noon on Saturday. That deadline came and went. I don't believe all hostages were released. What happened?
I don't know. One of the things that you learn early on is that you shouldn't make threats that you're not prepared to follow through on. And the Trump administration, we're not even a month into this administration yet. Can you believe this? The Trump administration has made a pattern of promising really extreme results and then not delivering. If you look to Israeli military Israeli news sources, there have been some discussions that, Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying that hell will be unleashed on their schedule. But there's also real deliberations, real splits in Israel about whether some members of the cabinet want all the hostages to be released in exchange for further releases. And so Hamas just seems to have stuck to the original agreement, betting that neither Israel nor the United States wants to restart the war right now. And that seems to have worked out. We'll see in a week, 2 weeks' time what's happened. As you know, there's always a delay between observing some provocation or observing some failure to perform and then seeing this. But I assume from Hamas's perspective, they believe they had a deal, that this was an attempt to unilaterally renegotiate it, and they just stuck to what they were doing. And those consequences so far have not played out.
At the same time, it also seems as if the Americans and the Israelis are reading from the same song sheet when it comes to Trump's plan for Gaza, which the UN has called forced displacement tantamount to ethnic cleansing. Do you think he's crossed that line?
I think that were this plan to happen in the way that President Trump has laid out, it would in fact be a forced population transfer, and that would be the sort of political redrawing of populations that has not been a standard part of statecraft since really the 1940s, a very dark period. Even the Wall Street Journal, I believe, had an editorial last week in which they said, well, countries used to do this. Well, there's a reason why countries aren't supposed to do this sort of thing anymore. Forced population transfers are extremely grievous, and they could lead to harms in the short and greater harms in the long term. For all that, this remains talk. The Trump administration has pretty well signaled that if Egypt, Jordan, and other governments want to avoid this, they should come up with creative plans. Other capitals around the region are scrambling to do this. And just as a practical matter, resettling 2 million people into countries that don't want them, have very strong security interests in not wanting them, that's a tall order. So on the one hand, we're playing with dynamite, we're playing with rewriting the rules of international order, and I don't say that lightly. On the other hand, as I said before, the Trump administration's pattern is often to promise to do something extreme and then not necessarily follow through on it.
Indeed. And as you say, rewriting the rules of international order. What's also interesting to me is that in the next 2 weeks, we are going to see this region really becoming the center of global attention. Saudi Arabia emerging as a global power broker here. What does it say about U.S. diplomatic leverage that the Trump-Putin meeting is going to be brokered in Riyadh instead of Washington or a European capital?
It's really interesting to me to see the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia emerging as a country who can offer good offices to broker this sort of arrangement. One reason that you often go through a third country is that you don't have to have either country concede that they are asking for favors or have the optics of having these meetings take place in Washington or Moscow. But this also means that the Saudi government is pretty clearly keeping its options open for the future and is signaling that it has the sorts of relations with Moscow that it can use to offer this to the United States. But that's also a warning to the United States not to take its regional partners necessarily for granted. I think that, yeah, as you said, over the next couple of weeks, there's going to be so much attention on this region, so much diplomatic capacity. It's also a really clear signal to Europe that, as the Trump administration has said, Europe may not necessarily have a part in these negotiations. The Trump administration wants to keep European governments sidelined. Riyadh is not in Europe, and it's a clear signal that this is something that there's global interest in, and that elevates the United States to be a stronger negotiating partner.